Thank you, Dr. Rebekah Shirley. Thank you for coming to the conference and speaking to us about your projects you're doing within Borneo and Nairobi, Kenya. Once again, one of the key points that you mentioned here at the Just Transition Initiative and the Oil and Gas Conference was you mentioned communication and how research and communication go hand in hand. Could you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, I thought it was something that I had to bring up in the context of all of the other discussions that were happening today around the just transition and this idea of, the question I think that we're trying to ask here is how do we create and ensure a just and equitable and fair transition to this low carbon energy future. And I think while law and regulation and policy are big parts of that, equally important and connected, and I'll come to that in a second, is the idea of science communication and data communication. And I think that's important because as academics, and I myself am a scientist that was trained at UC Berkeley in California in energy resources and sort of power system simulation and that kind of thing, we tend to produce data and publish data, but not necessarily publicize data, publicize findings. And I think that onus falls on us, especially as a lot of this research happens with, public funds. People are paying taxes. They should have access to information, and it should be a part of our job to also help make sure that people have access. And why is the access important? I think that, as you're seeing over and over again in the conference, there's so many sort of impacts associated with energy planning and strategy and implementation of projects that really, unless you have the right data about what alternatives look like, what the sort of the total impacts look like, and what the various sort of long-term implications of projects look like, you might have a skewed idea of what the best thing to do for a country is. And so that communication of science and data is important for policymakers, but it's equally as important for the general public, for them to be informed, for them to be able to be part of the decision-making process. Because I think in theory, decision-making processes should not be just policymakers, right? They're making policy on behalf of. And so the more people that have access to information and understand impacts, as I mentioned, and alternatives, I think the better for us all in creating this just future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the long and short is communication is key as well as research.
Yes.
Because you're going to have that social participation.
You have to have
element.
both of them. You have to have the research, but you have to, I really want to speak to researchers out there, really need to be working with the media, working with those that are involved in producing documentaries, writing blogs, the news, radio programs. I think the more communication that we have, the more sensitization of the public that we have around ideas that are, about technology and what's possible, the more dialogue we'll have about what's possible, and then the more action we'll have on what's possible.
Fair enough. Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my second and last question is, I know you're doing some great stuff within Nairobi, Kenya, with Power for All. How do you see what you're doing there translate to helping the Caribbean region?
Yeah. So many ways. So I direct research for an NGO, and I'm based in Nairobi. So I work with a really fantastic team of researchers. We also work with local universities over there in doing our research. And we have a couple of different areas that we're looking at right now. For instance, we're trying to explore the relationship between energy access and jobs creation and understand what the real skills gaps that need to be filled are. We're doing a bit of work on electric vehicles and understanding sort of what kinds of how to create markets for electric vehicles in spaces like East Africa. And we're doing a bit of work as well now on utilities of the future and understanding how centralized and decentralized technologies for energy service provision can really work together in a business sense. All of that to say, I think that there's a lot of transferable lessons that we're learning through this research that are absolutely applicable to the Caribbean. When we think about the EVs research, just to bring that up again, there's so much opportunity, I think, for small island states to be seen as markets for electric vehicles. If you think, for instance, just about the fact that we have so much solar renewable energy potential, it's potential. We actually have more potential than we can actually bring onto our grids for a number of different technical reasons. But if we had, sort of a massive fleet conversion and had really big EV markets, that's potentially a major off-taker for some of this power at peak times when power is being produced. I'm not going to get into the details, but there's so many things that you could think about as opportunities in the Caribbean that maybe we don't have research going on here right now, but research is happening elsewhere. And I think a lot of those lessons, from a cultural point of view, from a social point of view, from an economics point of view, are transferable to the Caribbean. And so I think for me as a Caribbean person doing work in Africa, it's really important to keep those connections alive so that I can figure out ways to transfer what I'm learning out here and again communicate about it.
Yeah, fair enough. I might have misled you. Did say my last question, but I actually have one more.
Not a worry.
So what do you see as, for the Caribbean region, one of those, I say the major hurdle regarding the Just Transition Initiative and moving towards that low carbon economy?
I think it's willingness from the policy point, from the policy stakeholders. I think you do have a lot of really fantastic renewable energy resource here. We do have a lot of developers that are willing to come to the Caribbean and do that kind of work. I have really fantastic friends that are involved in efforts like Carolec, as you probably are aware of. So we're creating networks of developers and practitioners here. I think all we need is that political willingness to do some things that are going to be necessary, like putting certain incentives in place, putting certain standards in place, and certain policies in place to create the broader ecosystem within which practitioners can do their thing. So I think political willingness is just kind of, that's the thing that I think is kind of really holding us back from unlocking this future. And again, it all comes back to the communications topic, right? Of making sure that our stakeholders that represent us are aware of the options and the possibilities that we could be leveraging, but we aren't at the moment.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Rebekah, again, thank you very much for your time, and once again, thank you for being a part of
course,
the Oil and Gas Law and Just Transition Initiative Conference.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.